Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week, we take a couple of data points, we use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us this week in Brussels. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we will be actually talking about dinosaurs. That is a new one for us, so stick around to hear about the economics of dinosaurs, to the delight of my 6-year-old, I'm sure. But first, something more from the news. So, the news data point this week is negative 0.9. That is the annualized rate of growth, or I guess rate of decline, as it happens, of the U.S. GDP.
Oh my gosh, down 0.9% on first look at second quarter GDP.
As the GDP report is out today, it signals the U.S. economy shrank 0.9% at an annual rate in the second quarter.
The GDP drop reflects declines in private inventory investment, residential fixed investment, and federal government spending.
So that has led to a debate about whether we're now in a recession in the United States. We'll get into why that's a debate rather than just a simple observable fact in just a second. But the other remarkable thing about these GDP numbers is that they're paired with ominous inflation numbers released from the day before. So high inflation paired with declining growth, that's the economic state known as stagflation, which is a whole nother debate that economists are having about the present economy. So to dig into all this, Adam, I guess I first wanted to ask about stagflation. Economists apparently used to believe that this combination of stagnation in the economy and inflation was impossible, if I understand correctly. So why did they think that in the first place?
This is really a crucial question to understand, as it were, why stagflation seems like a contradiction in terms. And the basic logic here is that inflation is driven by aggregate demand. That's the total volume of purchasing power chasing the amount of goods and services that are on offer or that an economy is able to produce in a given period. So an inflationary situation is one in which demand exceeds supply, broadly speaking, and so prices will go up. But that would lead you to predict not stagnation, of course, but rapid economic growth, right? Because if there's this demand out there in the economy for production, then production will boom. It's only really when all possibilities for physically increasing the supply of goods and services has been exhausted, or that it's getting at the margin more and more expensive, that you would expect prices to rise. So from this point of view, the idea that you could actually combine slow growth or slowing growth or even a recession with inflation just seems like a contradiction. Indeed, from the 1950s onwards, there was a very famous trade-off curve known as the Phillips curve, after a New Zealand economist, William Phillips, and a paper he published in 1958 that described a trade-off between higher rates of unemployment and lower inflation, or lower rates of unemployment and higher inflation. In other words, as the economy ran hot and the labour market got tight, you'd expect inflation to accelerate and the reverse. So for inflation and stagnation to occur at the same time means that something really is broken in the economy. Something's gone wrong. It basically means that aggregate demand, the purchasing power that's out there, is being swallowed up by increasing prices and not being translated into economic output and growth, even though you would expect capacity to be there. And it means probably that businesses and employees are kind of locked in an inflationary psychology where they think that the priority has got to be not to maximize production or efficiency or whatever, but just keep up with the constantly rising level of wages and prices. And that's a deeply unhealthy state for the economy to be in. The last time we were there was really in the 1970s. Where you did see a shocking deceleration in the growth rate from the 60s through to the 70s and a surge in inflation. Whether we're going to see anything really remotely as bad as that, I think, is more than unlikely. But nevertheless, this year we are seeing this conjunction of slowing growth, the most rapid slowdown in growth we've seen in 80 years, actually, and combined with rising inflation, which has given rise to this meme of stagflation as a way of describing our current situation.
So as I said, there seems to be some ambiguity about whether the United States is in a recession at all. President Joe Biden denies that the United States is in a recession. People on the other side straightforwardly are describing it as a recession. So Why is there this ambiguity at all? And who decides if there's a recession or not, Adam?
Because the economy isn't like a game for which there's a single referee, a single authority. There's no absolute authority in economic commentary. It's to a degree conventional. And by convention in the US, it's the National Bureau of Economic Research, and specifically its Business Cycle Dating Committee, that calls this. It was a committee that was set up in 1978. And it's adopted as a kind of conventional definition the idea that 2 periods, 2 quarters, so that's 6 months, of a decline in GDP is the best measure. And so that's why, as it were, there's a degree of argument here, because it's a question of deciding on the referee, it's a question of deciding on the metric to use, and then deciding what movement in that metric will actually constitute a recession. You might think that this was really a matter simply of empirical evidence or something like that, but that's really naive to imagine, I think, that by itself is enough to decide this issue.
So they're looking for 2 straight quarters of economic contraction. I mean, how long has this been the definition of a bad economy exactly? I mean, are there alternative ways of deciding or of describing what a bad economy is? I mean, right now we're talking about the GDP growth rate, but are there sort of other more important indicators of an economy's health? The unemployment rate in the United States is, pretty low. Is that a sign that the economy is actually strong rather than in a bad state?
Yeah, so the NBR was established in 1920 as an agency to measure the American economy at the same time as a bunch of business cycle institutes were also established in Europe, in places like Germany, even the Soviet Union. And the reason they focus on GDP is it's by far and away the most aggregative measure of economic activity. And labor would be a good measure, but it's only one market, it's the labor market. And you could measure, and in the 19th century, so-called business cycle economists did measure the swings in the economy by using things like indicators like the iron and steel production or railway traffic, which are very dramatic. And those capture swings in the business cycle are often in an anticipatory way, because you can see movements in railway activity or iron and steel production track investment activity, which tends to turn down ahead of the rest of the economy. But they are by definition rather limited measures of economic activity. And to get the whole economy, what you really need is a measure of a total production or total expenditure or total income. And that's what GDP or national income numbers measure. And that's why we focus on them. The swings in GDP tend to be more mild. They're not as dramatic, which is why as limited a contraction as 2 quarters of GDP, negative growth in GDP, are enough to warrant a description as a recession, because that generally goes hand in hand with some much more severe shocks in particular sectors, which are going to be particularly hard hit.
Got it. So if we are, in fact, in a recession, would it be fair to say that the proximate cause in this instance was the decision by the central bank in the United States, and, I guess by analogy, if there are recessions elsewhere, the central bank's there to raise interest rates? Obviously, we all know that there are these dramatic increases in interest rates in the United States. Leaving aside whether that was necessary, was that the cause of this potential recession?
Yes, absolutely. What the central banks want to do is to prevent market-driven inflation getting out of hand. And so they make a surgical strike, if you like, at a relatively early stage of this process. The idea being, I think, that if you do that, you prevent the excesses of an inflationary spike really running their full course. And overall, though it's painful in the short run, that'll be better for the overall economy if central banks intervene in that way. So to that extent, we live in really quite into managed market economies. We never really experience the full flux of a market economy unregulated by and unmanaged by central bank intervention. The vast majority of recessions in the United States in recent years have been brought about to a considerable extent as a result of the tightening of monetary policy. So when we look at the course of the business cycle in the US, we are seeing the fingerprints of central bank policy everywhere.
Yeah, I guess that leads to my final question. This relates to your last big essay for FP, which I would encourage everyone to read, on the sort of analogy between today and the 1970s and the ways that's not apt. And one of the things you describe there is how, as a result of sort of winning the social conflicts that emerged in the 1970s over inflation, et cetera, central banks have concentrated tremendous power in their hands over the economy in general. And yeah, that raised for me the question, kind of what happens if they screw up? I mean, what if kind of in this situation, if they sort of overcorrect and it causes a bigger recession than maybe was necessary? Does this concentration of power make them more politically vulnerable to a kind of insurrection in economic terms, a sort of exposing the central banks to the public once the public becomes conscious of this kind of political arrangement? So yeah, is economic power that's concentrated and insulated in the hands of central banks in this way just ultimately more fragile in a broader political sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of, what an insurrection would look like is the really cool one, because, in the 1970s, you could talk of large-scale organized labor as a potential countervailing force in modern societies. Certainly in Europe, this was true to a considerable extent. In the UK, governments were toppled by protesting and striking trade unionists. In Italy, we have, a situation that created deep anxiety on the part of the State Department and the national security apparatus in the US. Even in the US, where there was no threat really of insurrection, there was nevertheless, genuine large-scale organized labor as a countervailing force in economic policy that was also taken seriously. Those were all, however, forces which tended to push in an inflationary direction. I mean, if the Fed and other central banks are accused of, in your words, screwing up in the current moment, it's not for it's after all not for failing to enable the economy to run hot. That's exactly what they've done. And so what we would be facing with today is a reaction, an insurgency against inflation, a kind of deflationary insurgency. And that's de facto the politics of conservatism. And we see that kind of politics, of course, brought into play in the current moment in Germany in particular. In other parts of Europe, we're going to see, I think, particular pressure now brought to bear on the ECB to do something about inflation. But it's pretty difficult to really conceive of what a deflationary insurrection would look like as a kind of movement. What we have seen is not so much insurrection as just sort of populist clashes. So one only has to go as far back as 2019, the final 2 years of the Trump presidency, to see the way in which tension can build up between a thoroughly unprincipled administration that really has no interest in anything other than good economic numbers and a booming stock market, and the Fed, which in 2019 was still trying to engineer a tightening of monetary policy, what they called a normalization of monetary policy. And before COVID hit and changed the economic policy game entirely, there was really the risk of a kind of quasi-constitutional clash between the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve economists who run monetary policy over this issue of whether the Fed would be, would be able to carry through a program of normalization. In other words, a policy of raising interest rates without facing really damaging attacks from Trump and the Trumpy wing of the GOP, which quite like the idea of stripping the Fed of power, though their vision of monetary policy tends to tend towards the gold standard, which, if anything, would be even more deflationary. Certainly in the current moment, with the Biden administration in charge, there's very little risk of that kind of scenario. The Biden people are far too mainstream to want to attack the Fed in any kind of way. So right now, given the particular risks and the particular accusations against the central banks, it's pretty hard to imagine a insurrectionary type challenge to any of the major central banks in the West. But certainly the politics of central banking remains very much alive and is indeed delicate and can be quite explosive.
Just to clarify here, I mean, is it really not possible to imagine a kind of populist energy on monetary policy from the left, a movement to make monetary policy more political, to make it more explicitly progressive or leftist, to remove it from sort of technocratic insulation and just make it serve the people in a more progressive way? Is that not an imaginable sort of circumstance?
You're kind of breaking my heart, Cam, because until a year or two ago, that would be, of course, the politics that the folks like myself were really very directly involved in and pushing for. But I mean, the current conjuncture and for the foreseeable future really suggests that that's a vain hope in the current moment. Why? Because the inflationary pressure is so severe currently, and with inflation numbers up close to 10% both in Europe and the United States. The moment for an active expansionary monetary policy is just not right. There's very little, I think, viability in political terms for that kind of politics, which was certainly, I think, a horizon for a kind of optimistic vision of economic policy in the last couple of years, and indeed on a whole variety of issues. And progress has been made. The agenda of central banking is significantly widened. One of the reasons why the Fed was so slow to tighten is that it was, in fact, to a degree, prioritizing the labor market, which is part of its mandate. And in fact, it was prioritizing social justice considerations, in the sense that it was part of its dashboard for the US labor market was black male unemployment, which is the most sensitive indicator of how much slack there is in the American labor market. But the huge and shock to the price system from the issue, the variety of issues which have arisen, we've talked about several times in 2021 and 2022, has just completely changed the nature of this game. Now, that doesn't mean that one couldn't still, advocate for much greater democratization of monetary policy, and indeed the push towards a more conservative stance makes that in many ways more important. But we're certainly no longer in the space in which the aim of the game was, if you like, to use central banks to facilitate larger scale and more ambitious politics in other areas. It's been a very sudden sea change, I think, and I think those of us interested in the progressive development of economic policy have yet to really come to terms with the implications of this, because it's a really very dramatic pivot.
Well, I did not mean to sort of stick my finger in your wound there, Adam, but we do need to leave it there for now, but we will be back in a second to talk about dinosaurs. So stick around. Hi, and welcome back. The next data point is 12.4 million. That is the number of dollars that a raptor, at least the bones of a raptor dinosaur, sold for at an auction recently held by Christie's.
The skeleton, named Hector, was excavated from Wolf Canyon near Edgar back in 2015. It stretches nearly 10 feet long. It is made from 126 fossilized bones that date back 115 million years.
We did some listener questions a few weeks ago, and actually my 6-year-old son, he actually wanted to know the price of, I think he said, a brachiosaurus. So it was serendipitous when we came across this data point. So Adam, I guess, first of all, is there really like a broader market here for dinosaur bones? I mean, who's buying these dinosaur bones, and sort of what range of prices are we talking about when we're talking about dinosaur fossils?
So there is a market. It's hard to get a sense of exactly how big it is from like the sort of numbers that are regularly quoted on, in the sort of headline auctions. It's pretty hard to see how it could be more than maybe $100 million a year, absolute maximum. I think it's probably smaller than that, given that the really prized items go for, 10, 12 million top dollar. It's important to qualify that what's being sold here is not bones, but fossils, right? So things as old as this aren't the actual organic matter bones. It's the mineral deposits that form within the bones over millions of years that are then solidified essentially into shaped rock, right? That is what's being sold. And this is what we mean when we say surviving dinosaur bones, is what we actually mean is fossils. And the thing about this market is it's kind of weird. In principle, there's really a lot of fossils because we're talking about millions of years of deposits. I think the really difficult thing is to decide, how large the legal market for this stuff is and how big the illegal market is. Because in principle, in the US anyway, if you find dinosaurs on private property, then they're yours to keep and to buy and sell. It's different for federal land, where many of these fossils come from. Their ownership is much harder to establish, and there are some notoriously controversial cases. Another issue is international smuggling, with some very significant finds coming out of Mongolia, and sourcing those, getting the provenance right, is also highly complicated. The people that buy do include museums, but most recently and most notoriously involves celebrity buyers. So both Leonardo DiCaprio and Nicolas Cage are well known to have, significant private collections. And it's those that really tend to grab the headlines and to disturb the scientific community, which is extremely concerned about these giant and significant relics of early life on Earth disappearing into private hands. Altogether, I think one shouldn't exaggerate the scale of this market. There's no gigantic piece of global capitalism. As far as brachiosauruses are concerned, As far as I'm able to establish, I mean, these are giant beasts, right? These are not small things. And what I think you can buy is models. And I mean, those, like even a good big model of one of these brachiosauruses goes for about $100,000. So God knows what a genuine, true life large one would go for. I've not actually been able to find any for sale, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, that's still outside my son's price range. I think he'll have to save his allowance money for a while to get to that $100,000 even, I think. But I do want to burrow down a bit more on how this market has, just changed how museums and research institutions gain access to dinosaur bones. I feel like before there was this big, I guess, celebrity market, these other institutions probably didn't have much competition. So are they sort of getting crowded out? Like, what is the story for them these days?
I think there is a real risk of that. I mean, it's easy to exaggerate the appetite of museums for large dinosaur objects because they're very difficult to display. There are huge collections of dinosaurs not on display held in the vaults of the major museums all over the world, and for many of the more common dinosaur specimens, there are far more fossils out there in the world than there are museums that want to display them. So it's a very weird market in that sense, is that in the underlying commodity fossils it's not clear really how, in what real sense it's scarce, because what is the demand for them on the marketplace? It's a very, very limited niche zone. But one thing that has happened for the really choice instances, like the T-Rexes and so on, what's happened there is that you build sponsorship coalitions. So a museum will bid with the backing of a corporate sponsor who will pre-commit to cover whatever the costs are going to be. And since, the most expensive specimens are going for 12 million, 10, 15, that kind of ballpark, these are commitments which large corporate sponsors of museums are willing to make, especially if they can do it in partnership. And that puts museums in a position to remain competitive in this market. I don't want to sound complacent because obviously this is, it's in some ways a terrifying prospect that this heritage should disappear into private hands. But I do think there are easy ways of ensuring that museums continue to get access in future.
Yeah, that's clarifying to say that there may not be scarcity of dinosaur fossils. I mean, that we just may have all the fossils we need in some sense, because what is the demand? It's hard to clarify, I guess, but interesting. Yeah, you mentioned, I guess, the higher end dinosaurs in this market. I mean, just to clarify, are some dinosaurs just consistently more expensive than others? Are there certain species that at any given moment are sort of the hot dinosaurs to have?
Well, I mean, I think it is largely driven by, sort of the attraction of movies like Jurassic Park, which has really transformed the market and the attention. But I mean, the interest in dinosaurs goes back all to the 19th century when they were first discovered and became part of large-scale dinosaur exhibits. And it's really the T-Rex, I think, which dominates the entire market. That's the dinosaur which most clearly symbolizes and encapsulates the terror of these great monstrous animals that once roamed the earth. So they consistently command, the T-Rexes are the bones and the fossils which most consistently command the largest prices.
So again, just to clarify here, I mean, in what sense are dinosaur fossils a public good at all? I mean, it just sort of raises the question, like, if we are investing in these dinosaur fossils in the space of museums and other research institutions, I mean, what is the return exactly? I mean, why do we even know so much about dinosaurs at all? I mean, is this just a kind of inefficient diversion of resources in some way?
This is a really terrible question. I mean, we're an economics podcast, and we have to ask questions like this. But at some point, this is like terrible.
I know. I'm asking it for the sake.
You're not going to tell your son that you asked this question, Cam. Like, Daddy,
but
we should know less about dinosaurs. What are you saying?
Do you know how many books I've read about dinosaurs in the last several years? Do you know how much I know? Even just, I mean, and I was the same way. So like, why? I mean, this is an incredible amount of time I've even just spent talking about dinosaurs in recent years. So I don't know why. Just why is a fair question, right?
No. There's an answer. There's answers. Like, I mean, because in a sense, right, the creation story, especially for Christian societies, is absolutely fundamental, right? And the refutation by way of the discovery of the fossil remains of truly, truly ancient history, which clearly did not fit within the conventional timelines of biblical creationism in the course of the 19th century, was completely explosive. Along with the Darwinian theory of evolution, which made humans descendants of monkeys, the existence of dinosaurs was a really fundamental discovery of Victorian science. And that then made, the reason why they are public goods is because there's laws which say they are. So, the 1906 Antiquities Act in the United States established a typically Teddy Roosevelt kind of measure, established the fact that these sorts of remains found on public land were indeed public property and valuable public property and subject to very tight regulation as to what could be done with them. And they then become part of the collective systematic knowledge about the development of life on our planet and its vicissitudes, right? So again, another reason why the dinosaur stories for the modern world matter so much is not just that, as it were, they totally refute biblical creationism, but also because they then pose questions about how they became extinct. So thinking about dinosaurs is also a way of thinking about the end of the world as we know it, right? That's what makes them so fascinating, is that clearly these mighty animals once dominated our Earth, and then at some point they no longer do. And so the story of how that happens is itself highly significant. Two further points to make, I think, are that not a lot of money actually gets spent on paleontology. It's really quite shocking if you look at the allocation of grants by the National Science Foundation over a period of 20 or 30 years. It's peanuts. There are only 650 registered members or so of the Paleontology Society in the United States. There's little reason to be concerned that we're overcommitting societal resource to researching our. But the horrible fact may be that all things are relative, right? And so one thing that dinosaurs do is crowd out other types of study of ancient life on Earth, and at two ends, right? One thing they do is as so-called charismatic megafauna, right? This is a phrase from environmentalism and protection of biodiversity. These huge animals crowd out, on the one hand, the study of plant life on Earth, which of course is prior to the development of complex animals. And they also tend to crowd out the development of early mammalian development, which, of course, in the dinosaur story is often made into the villain of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And so, within the tiny budgets that are allocated to the study of these really fundamental questions, which are really scandalously small, given the significance of these questions for our societies and our cultural understanding, within that limited ambit, you could say, why is your son not asking you to talk much more about plant life on the planet before the dinosaurs arrived, or the little furry animals that came afterwards, which we are, of course, more closely related than we will ever be to dinosaurs.
Yeah, but there's no sort of big paleontology that is manipulating my son into asking me about all this. It's sort of organic. He's just sort of huge animals.
I don't think, no. Hilarious big paleontology that's in league with Mattel to ruin your life. Yeah.
Organization out there. Yeah, I don't know. I'm just here to ask the questions. Anyway, I know while we're here, I guess I would end by asking, what exactly do you think about the premise of Jurassic Park? You brought it up. So for those not acquainted, this is a movie, and before that, a book that describes the kind of creation of an island, sort of with living reincarnated dinosaurs for the purposes of tourism. It ends up all going wrong, obviously, in the movie. Would this be an economically viable project?
Well, apparently there are sufficient, Jurassic Park aficionados that there's an entire YouTube page devoted to actually crunching the numbers on this. And one estimate puts the cost of construction at $23 billion and the annual operating budget at over $11 billion. And
wow.
And, given the fact that apparently in the latest installation of the franchise, some details about the commercial operations of the park become known. Apparently, not surprisingly perhaps, because it's not very accessible. Apparently the park is located in a remote island off the coast of Costa Rica, accessible only by ferry. So it only actually sees about 20,000 visitors per day. And so it's pretty difficult to amortize a project at $23 billion with an annual budget of $11 billion with only 20,000 visitors, when you think that Disneyland's pre-pandemic attendance was about 50,000 visitors per day. So it's not altogether clear that Jurassic Park, as imagined, is an entirely viable business plan. On the other hand, venture capital these days is pretty crazy stuff. And $15 million was rapidly called together to fund the efforts to recreate the woolly mammoth using CRISPR genome editing technology. So we may not quite get it to dinosaurs, but the resurrection of woolly mammoths might seem quite viable. Other suggestions imply that the way to go with this is not necessarily to create an entire theme park, but to make other options. In other words, to incorporate the occasional resurrected dinosaur into other wildlife installations, or to use the occasional resurrected dinosaur for ecological management, so they could be established as apex predators, or even, and perhaps most alarmingly, that you could insert dinosaur DNA into the genetics of other animals to maximize, for instance, meat production. So we can end up with ghastly hybrids of modern beef cattle, perhaps, and dinosaur DNA to simply get them to grow bigger. So all of those might be more viable business propositions than actually building a theme park.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I admit I was thinking about the insurance costs. I don't know who would sort of cover the insurance.
I looked into that. Yeah, I looked into wild insurance proposals. Because, presumably you'd have to get everyone to sign waivers, and whether those would be legally ironclad is another issue. And then, given what happens in the Jurassic Park franchise, obviously you have to reckon with the escape.
Yeah, just imagine the lawsuits
we all
after,
laugh.
yeah.
But in insurance, insurance exists to take on these kind of risks, right? The entire business model is outside tail risks, and you insert those tail risks then into portfolios. And of course, you'll make outsized returns on them. And so for instance, Allianz has devised a policy for private space travel. So, these crazy millionaires who decide they want to take a ride into low Earth orbit or whatever, they can get personal insurance on that activity. So, frankly, if you build it, they will come. I think in the insurance industry, there's no question at all that you could construct a market for this. It would be, you'd have to have a few visitors eaten by the dinosaurs to establish what the precise risk profile was. But with a sufficient track record and be able to estimate the loss rate of visitors to the island, you could then begin to construct a contract to cover this.
Okay, if I remember the quote from the first movie, I think it's "Life finds a way." I guess that's. You could say capitalism finds a way. Maybe if the technology's out there one day. Still a hypothetical. And I will try to play this segment for my son to answer his questions. I'm guessing he won't listen for too long because he'll want to go outside and play basketball or something. Okay, that's it for another episode of Ones and Twos. Thanks as always to my co-host Adam Tooze. Listeners, as always, we like hearing your feedback. Please email us at podcast@foreignpolicy.com or tweet us at onesandtwosPod. Remember, that's Tooze as in Adam's name, Tooze. And of course, remember to follow and review us on your favorite podcast app. Ones and Twos is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Laura Rossbrow-Tellem and Rob Sachs. Our social media manager is Claudia Tatey. The executive editor of FP Podcast is Dan Efron. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you back in your feed next week.